There is a movement going on in America, a growing commitment to quality in our products, services, technologies, and most importantly, our people. Continuous quality and productivity improvement is not a passing fad. It has become an economic imperative. And now, more than ever, we must strengthen the vital partnership between academia, industry, and government. How we respond individually and collectively to the challenges ahead will determine our nation's success and survival in the 21st century. Virginia Tech is dedicated to helping you plan, initiate, and sustain continuous improvement in your organization, to challenge and change the fundamental ways you lead, manage, and work, and to assist you in charting a path for excellence in the 1990s and beyond. This teleconference series was developed as a joint effort between the College of Engineering and the College of Business. By integrating the concepts of many disciplines, we believe greater levels of productivity can be achieved through quality leadership and management.
Excellence is often defined as exceeding ordinary standards. A land-grant university is defined by its role in teaching, creating new knowledge, and often serving as a catalyst in transferring the synergy of current technology and current knowledge beyond the campus and indeed at times around the world. Our ability to maintain, in many cases, regain our competitiveness means that Virginia Tech must meet these needs with energy, not isolation or inaction. Our obligation is to channel cutting-edge knowledge and skills to those who understand that tomorrow will be built on an ethic of quality.
As one of the nation's leading research universities, we are dedicated to the discovery of new knowledge and to translating it into practical ways of improving society. Increasing efficiency through effective leadership and management of our nation's manufacturing and service organizations is our goal. We can achieve greater levels of performance by teaching our undergraduate and graduate students in our classrooms and by teaching adults through our public service efforts.
As a land-grant university, we're involved in research, teaching, and public service, and we're particularly interested in integrating the resources of the university with the needs of business and industry and private and public organizations throughout the state of Virginia, the nation, and indeed the world as a whole. It is extremely important that we keep current the knowledge base of the individuals that work in your organizations by bringing them in closer touch with the new knowledge generated in the university. We're very much interested in learning of your needs and working with you in creating a set of meaningful programs.
Communications technology makes it possible for Virginia Tech to transmit our knowledge to the world. Through the combined efforts of the Colleges of Engineering and Business, the Division of Continuing Education, and the Office of Distance Learning, you, our audience, can benefit from our efforts to bring change and quality through improved leadership and management. What begins at Virginia Tech reaches far beyond the mountains of Southwest Virginia. The Virginia Tech Perspectives, Quality Leadership and Management series of teleconferences are designed to enhance your understanding of how to improve your organization through increased productivity. Knowledge is both powerful and virtuous, and by learning together, we can solve human problems for the Commonwealth, the nation, and the world.
Welcome to the Virginia Tech series of programs on quality leadership and management, and today's seminar on involving employees in quality improvement, the role of human resources management. I'm Stan Huffman, your moderator for this series of programs designed to implement leadership to make your organization more productive. Let me preview the activities for today. We will have one major presenter who will talk about human relations management. We will have 3 question and answer periods for you, our television audience. Use the number that is on your screen to call questions in to us. Our presenter for today is Dr. Dane Partridge, Assistant Professor of Management in the R.B. Pamplin College of Business. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in labor relations and human resources management. His interest in research involves employment relations implications in a technological change society, and in organization restructuring. He is also interested in the factors which affect the process and success of employee involvement in unionized organizations. He is frequently called upon to make presentations to groups about human resources management. Here is Dr. Partridge.
Thank you, Stan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to present this program to you today to share some of what I've learned in my own study of employee involvement and total quality management. I basically have three objectives for this afternoon. First, to develop an understanding of what employee involvement is. Secondly, to consider a number of cases of employee involvement and how that works in quality improvement. And thirdly, to look at some do's and don'ts for implementing employee involvement in your own organizations. Now, the change toward total quality management, or TQM, has altered much conventional management thinking regarding not only employee involvement, empowering workers in the management of the workplace, but also in terms of education and training. TQM, for those of you who may not be aware, it can be defined as a commitment to continuous improvement in every aspect of the business. Now, the success of the Japanese is not due to lower wages necessarily or clever marketing, but to a continuous push to reduce variation in manufacturing process and products. Companies in this country that have made a commitment to total quality and excellence consider education and training as a required investment for their success. Now I'd like to turn to some motivating quotes to take us through the afternoon for our program. First, a quote from Lot Voller, Management of Industrial Engineering Services at Inland Steel. And let me make mention of the fact first that these are all quotes from engineering people, not from human resource management people. And it's interesting to note how much engineering people are now talking about organizational behavior issues and employee involvement. As Mr. Voller says, the key opportunity is the ability of management at all levels to provide the leadership necessary to implement greater democracy in the workplace so that empowerment and involvement become a reality and not just words. A second quote from Jack Burns, manager of industrial engineering at John Deere and Company. We must find better ways to tap the creative talent and energy of the American worker. This requires that we change from the concept of management to leadership. A third quote from a gentleman from Reynolds Metals Corporation, Wilt Wagner, Vice President and General Manager at Reynolds. The opportunity and the challenge is to develop true employee involvement, where all barriers to productivity, quality, and service are torn down, and everyone works together as a team to ensure survival in a global economy. Key issues from the worker's standpoint are job security, maintaining their standard of living, and a feeling of accomplishment. On the other hand, management's goals are profitability, return on investment, and customer satisfaction. Merging these divergent issues and satisfactorily resolving areas of conflict is critical. And finally, a quote from not an engineer, but the Vice President of Education and Training of the American Productivity and Quality Center, Mr. William Grunstom. The excellent companies, the one that win awards, the ones other companies benchmark against, these companies have one major trait in common. They view their human resources as a strategic advantage. They press that advantage by investing heavily in ongoing, effective education and training for their people. And most important, they link that education and training to their business strategy. So those are several quotes to motivate our discussion this afternoon of employee involvement in quality improvement in your organization. Next, I'd like to turn to a discussion of some of the effects of quality improvement. Now, you may have seen, if you read the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, a brand new study from the U.S. General Accounting Office mentioned in the Wall Street Journal. This study indicates that quality pays off, but not immediately. This new study is the first federal study of corporate quality improvement programs conducted by, as I mentioned, the General Accounting Office. It offers some of the first independent evidence that quality improvement actually works. Companies with aggressive quality improvement efforts have won big increases in market share, along with marked decreases in customer complaints and staff turnover. But the study cautions managers that getting such results takes time. Among the companies examined, it took an average of 2.5 years before the benefits of a quality management program became clear. And advances were not seen in every area. Companies did not report marked increases in retaining customers or in boosting their rates of return on sales or assets. The report analyzed data from 20 of the 22 companies that reached the final round in the first 2 years of the National Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award competition in 1988 and 1989. Now, to turn to those findings, again reported in the Wall Street Journal just on Tuesday, you can see that employee suggestions were up 16.6%. Market share up 13.7%. Order processing time down 12%. Customer complaints down 11.6%. Defects down 10.3%. And employee turnover down 6%. However, the study goes on to say, as I mentioned previously, that success is not obtained on all dimensions. To turn to the next visual, on-time delivery rates up, but only 4.7%. Overall customer satisfaction up 2.5%. Lost workdays down 1.8%. And then customer retention, return on assets, and return on sales all up 1%. The moral of the story to this point, in terms of this first major independent study on quality improvement, is that implementing quality improvement requires hands-on, continuous management. Now that we've discussed some of the effects of quality improvement, I'd like to turn to somewhat more of a theoretical issue and to discuss for the next several minutes moving from a control theory in the workplace to a commitment strategy of management, in particular human resource management. As you can see from the slide, there are several approaches, 2 approaches notably, to workforce management. And this material is drawn from a Harvard professor, Richard Walton, who has written numerous books and articles in this area. Walton suggests there are 2 radically different strategies for managing an organization's workforce, 2 incompatible views of what managers can reasonably expect of workers and the kind of partnership they can share with them. These strategies reflect a choice between imposing control on employees and eliciting commitment from employees. Now, the control strategy is the traditional approach in American management. And this approach, as you're all aware, took place during the early years of this century. Most notably, it followed the teachings of Frederick Taylor and the scientific management movement. It involved dividing work into basic job or task elements for which workers could be held accountable. And management organized its own responsibilities in a hierarchy of specialized roles, reinforced by a top-down allocation of authority. Today, however, pressure has built up against this approach, a model that assumes low employee commitment to the organization and that is designed to produce reliable, if not outstanding, performance, simply cannot cut it against world-class competition. Especially in a high labor cost country, such as the United States, market success depends on superior performance, which in turn requires high commitment from one's employees, which will be driven out by a control approach to management. The commitment strategy, as contrasted with the control strategy, really began to develop in this country in the 1970s. Experiments in the non-union sector of the economy developed this alternate strategy, and this strategy spread to a number of unionized companies in the 1980s. In this new commitment approach to the workforce, a commitment-based strategy to management and human resource management, jobs are designed to be broader than they have been before. Teams, not individuals, are often the unit within the organization that is held accountable for performance. Compensation policies reflect less the old strategy based on job evaluation, more the increased importance of the achievement of the group. Very important to the commitment strategy is the challenge of giving employees some sense of security, perhaps by offering them some priority in terms of training or retraining as old jobs are eliminated and new jobs are created. In unionized settings, it's also important that labor relations be made less adversarial and that the agenda for problem solving and discussion between union and management be broadened. At the center of the commitment strategy is a very basic belief, that employee commitment will lead to increased organizational performance. Commitment, on the other hand, or moving from the control strategy to the commitment strategy, does not come without some costs. As we turn to the next visual, we can see that there are a number of costs of commitment. Some organizations are simply better suited than others to the commitment model, although it does appear to be widely applicable both in the industrial sector of the economy and in the service sector. But again, there are costs. First, employment assurances. It's quite important in terms of moving toward a commitment strategy that employees be given some assurances with respect to employment. But there's a very real question as to how this can be done in a competitive environment. A second cost is in the area of compensation. While increased productivity under the commitment model should produce higher pay for employees, pay levels in many companies are already at a level that makes them not competitive in their industry. As one is moving from the control strategy to the commitment strategy, how can one increase compensation and still remain competitive? A third cost is in the area of technology. Computer-based technology is frequently the strategy that's being used in terms of technological change within organizations. But very simply, computer-based technology can be used in very different ways. It can be implemented in an organization in a way that simply reinforces the control strategy, where management retains control over the work and the operators out there on the work floor have very little training. Or on the other hand, new technology can be implemented in such a way that it's consistent with the commitment strategy, that power and knowledge and resources for decision making are pushed down in the organization to the actual operators who are out there on the shop floor. Management must make the decision when they're implementing new technology in the area of production, which strategy of management they wish to pursue, a control strategy or the commitment strategy. The fourth cost listed on our visual involves supervision and supervisors. The commitment model requires first-line supervisors to adopt a very different approach from the approach they have pursued historically. They will be required to facilitate rather than to direct the workforce. Supervisors must delegate away most of their traditional responsibilities, often without the supervisors, having received adequate training and support for their new team-building tasks. We'll talk more a little bit later in this first hour about some of the implications of employee involvement in quality improvement for first-line supervision and middle management. It's certainly not a trivial project, as many of you who are beginning this process are well aware, I'm sure. This new breed of supervisors must have interpersonal skills and analytical tools that aren't frequently found in your traditional supervisor. And then finally, the fifth cost for those organizations that are unionized, and that is in the area of union management relations. Some companies, as they have adopted this new style of management, the movement toward the commitment strategy, have attempted to pursue a de-unionization strategy, either by decertifying their unions in their existing plants or by attempting to open new greenfield sites and to keep those sites non-union. That is an issue in many unionized companies. How will union management relations proceed? Pressures are created significant pressures are created on those companies that are trying to adopt what we call in labor relations a partially unionized approach, where they are trying to improve cooperative relations with their labor unions in their unionized facilities, while at the same time they're trying to open new non-union facilities and to keep those facilities non-union. As you might imagine, that's not necessarily a very easy strategy to pursue, although frankly a lot of companies in the 1990s are attempting to do that. All right, we've talked about the control strategy, we've talked about the commitment strategy, and we've talked about some of the costs of commitment. Let's move on now to talk about the transition from control to commitment in your organization and how it might be done. If we can go to the to the next visual. The cornerstone of a transition from control to commitment is the voluntary participation of employees in problem-solving groups, such as in the initial stages, quality circles, or perhaps, as time moves on, something more advanced, perhaps even self-managing work teams. Managers must seek ways to consult employees about changes that affect them, but also management must avoid layoffs from higher productivity. Generally, during the early stages of transition, few immediate changes can be made in human resource areas such as basic job design, the compensation system, or the management system. As one is moving from control to commitment through a transitional stage, the literature suggests to us that areas of decision-making, such as involving employees, perhaps first through quality circles, may be the necessary first step. Very simply, it's easy to try to do too much too soon when one is moving from control to commitment, or, on the other hand, to only make cosmetic changes that really don't result in any significant change in the way that decisions are made or business is done in the organization. And then finally, as you can see on the visual, the last item is the rate of transformation, and the point here is simply that a number of companies are attempting to make this transition from control to commitment. The rate at which they're succeeding, however, varies widely from industry to industry and from company to company. Let me refer you, if you're not already familiar with it, to the source of this article, Richard Walton's article in the Harvard Business Review. This is a classic piece written back in 1985, where he discusses this change from control to commitment. Now that we've talked a little bit about not only the effects of quality improvement, and now in theory some of the difficulties in moving from control to commitment, let's focus in a little bit more specifically on employee involvement. And what I'd like to share with you next is a philosophy of employee involvement. If we can move to the next visual. This philosophy has been articulated by Paul Bannis, formerly of the Ford Motor Company. And I should insert here a brief tangent, and that is that we've had the privilege of having Paul here in Blacksburg to address the Management Department's Behringer Center affiliates, and I was just told yesterday by the director of that center that Paul had recently sent him a postcard from Paris, of all places. Paul has since retired, but Paul has articulated for the Ford Motor Company a number of important philosophies to keep in mind when we're looking at employee involvement. And let's take a look at those now. First, employees want more out of work than extrinsic rewards. Second, employees can achieve job satisfaction by directing their efforts toward improving work and the work environment. Third, employees want to develop their full capabilities. Fourth, employees want to participate in the success of the company. And fifth, the common interests are best served when there are common goals and mutual benefits. This is the philosophy of employee involvement that has been articulated by the Ford Motor Company and Mr. Bannis at Ford, and it underlies moving from a control strategy to a commitment strategy, changing the way we think about employees and what they want. Now, with respect to a unionized setting, for those organizations that are unionized, we need to recognize one additional thing, and that is that in a unionized setting, there's a three-way partnership. a recognition by employees, by the labor union, and by management that their common interests can best be served when there are common goals and mutual benefits. In addition, it's very important to emphasize at this point, and we can't emphasize this too strongly, that employee involvement is best thought of as a process and not a program. I'm sure that you've heard that frequently in your previous teleconferences with respect to quality improvement, and I'd simply like to reiterate that regarding employee involvement. Employee involvement, if it's going to work, is a process involving fundamental changes in the way management and employees relate. It is not a program. When companies think of employee involvement as simply a program, it runs the danger of becoming simply the flavor of the month, the program of the month, or the organization, as some organizations have been diagnosed, will run the risk of contracting programitis. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about employee involvement. Now what I'd like to share with you is some observations on the relationship between employee involvement and quality improvement that have been made by Ed Lawler. We were very fortunate this week here in Blacksburg to have Ed Lawler, who's with the University of Southern California and the Center for Effective Organizations, here on campus to again address the Behringer Center affiliates in the Department of Management. And Ed made a pretty provocative point, and so I'm going to lay it on Ed and make him take the blame for it, but I tend to believe this myself, and you may want to think about this during the rest of this first hour. Lawler makes the following observation in his work with organizations, and that is that there are two ways of thinking about employee involvement. One, that employee involvement is an important part of quality improvement, or secondly, that quality improvement is an important part of employee involvement. Now, you may want to think about how your organization thinks about employee involvement and quality improvement. Is employee involvement an important part of QI, quality improvement, or is it the other way around? Does your organization view quality improvement as a component of employee involvement? And let me tell you what Ed Lawler suggested. And again, Ed Lawler has a great deal of background and experience in this area. He's written some 200 articles and dozens of books. Lawler suggests that the first approach, thinking of employee involvement as an important part of quality improvement, is really the way that the Japanese have approached the subject. And when they have recently surveyed the Fortune 1000 organizations, he found that 75% of the organizations responded in that way. Employee involvement is an important part of quality improvement. At the risk of offending some of you, Lawler says that's backwards. He says that what we need to think about is quality improvement as being an important part of employee involvement. He suggests that if American firms are really going to be competitive in a global economy, we have to integrate employee involvement, we have to integrate quality improvement into employee involvement and focus first and foremost on changing the way we manage our organizations with respect to our employees. Again, that may generate a little bit of controversy out there at our various sites, so you may want to think about that some. Now that I've shared that with you, what I'd like to do next is to discuss the incidence of participation programs. We've been talking about employee involvement in a very generic way to this point. Now let's turn to looking at the incidence of employee involvement in organizations. First, what I'd like to share with you is some recent evidence published by the Department of Labor in a study by researchers who were then at Columbia University, Delaney, Lewin, and Ikniowski. And this research is a little bit dated now, but frankly it's about the most recent evidence we have. This survey was administered in 1987, and what it suggests is something very interesting. It suggests that employee involvement or participation programs are more common for unionized employees than non-union employees. This is the incidence of participation program by function and union status for various occupations: managers, non-union professional technical, non-union clerical, non-union manufacturing production, etc. And then the same for the unionized functions. All right? And what you can see here is that in this survey, Participation programs are somewhat more prevalent in the non-union sector. 42% of professional and technical employees are employed in organizations, let me correct that. 42% of those organizations responding indicated they had participation programs for their professional and technical employees. If we turn to union clerical employees, 48% of those organizations indicated they had participation programs for those employees, and 49% for manufacturing and production. If we turn now to the non-union sector, in the same survey, we see that the figures were 34% for non-union professional and technical, 34% for non-union clerical, and 43% for non-union manufacturing and production. All right. So the research, this study indicated that participation programs were in fact more common in the unionized sector than in the non-union sector, which frankly may surprise some people, because I think the conventional wisdom is it's generally more easy to implement employee involvement in a non-union organization. The data from this study suggests in fact just the opposite, that participation programs were somewhat more common in a unionized setting. But we should insert a caveat there. Although the incidence of participation was somewhat more prevalent in unionized companies, the depth of the participation within those organizations was not as great. To translate that, the extent of participation, in fact, is somewhat deeper, somewhat greater in non-union companies than in union organizations in this survey. In terms of support for these programs, another interesting finding. Managers of unionized organizations reported that more often than not, their unions supported the participation program rather than opposing them. I think we have a conventional wisdom among many of us that unions frequently oppose participation. This survey, this study suggests otherwise. And then finally, with respect to this study, in terms of the issues or the subjects involved, what was covered by the participation programs, as you might expect, product quality and work unit performance were consistently covered by the programs. Workflow and speed, less covered. The introduction of new technology, less covered. Safety and health, plant layout, supervision, less commonly included in these participation programs, especially among those unionized organizations responding. Let me turn now to a second study of the contemporary practice of employee involvement in the United States. And as you can see on this visual, employee involvement gets results. And this is a study that was put out by the American Productivity and Quality Center. I should write in here that this was published in 1989. Employee involvement is getting results and is gaining as a competitive strategy, but it's far below its full potential, according to this report, based on a survey of nearly 500 companies by the U.S. General Accounting Office. And again, this survey came out in 1989. It was done in 1987. 82% of the responding companies were using at least some form of employee involvement. And it's more common in larger companies than smaller companies, more common in manufacturing than in the service sector. Similar to the earlier study, the study that I mentioned just a minute ago, this study indicated that the use of employee involvement, while it's fairly wide, is not very deep. Only about 1/4 of the surveyed companies used more than a few of the many employee involvement techniques or applied them to a very large percentage of their workforce. Why did organizations use employee involvement? Well, not surprisingly, the major reason given by most companies was competitive advantage. That was the motivation, especially increasing product quality and productivity. A second reason for adopting these programs was to increase morale and to increase the motivation of the workforce. Finally, in terms of, if we can go back to the overhead, the impact of employee involvement on the management of the business is not remarkable to date. Simply put, the American Productivity and Quality Center found that the impact of employee involvement on the way firms manage their organizations was not very great, at least not as of 1987. Quality circles or other forms of participation groups and survey feedback were much more frequent than more innovative approaches such as self-managed work teams, mini enterprise units, work redesign efforts that fundamentally change the organization and fundamentally change the way decision-making occurs within the organization. This is what Ed Lawler, who was involved in this study, calls parallel participation programs. That is, parallel participation programs have been much more common to this point than non-parallel participation programs such as autonomous work groups. In a parallel participation program, as will become more clear in a minute, basically what happens is that worker participation is set up in such a way that really there are no fundamental changes in the way the organization is managed. You have a quality circle over here. It's a consultative type of arrangement. Workers gather for an hour a week or every other week to talk about quality issues, but there's not a fundamental change in the way management is handled, in the way business decisions are made. That's been the experience to date. Parallel participation, much more common. Okay. The survey also found, this 1989 study by the American Productivity and Quality Center also found that there was less sharing of information and knowledge than might have been expected, and very little linking of financial rewards to the performance of business units that employees could affect. The surveyed organizations had invested much more heavily in employee involvement techniques that focused on the individual, and they really hadn't done that much in terms of employee involvement that focused on the group. All right, so that's the read that we have as of 1987. Now let me share with you some information that you won't see anyplace else because Ed Lawler brought it with him to Blacksburg, and this hasn't been published yet. If we can go to the next visual, we can see some 1987 data, basically from the report that I was just mentioning, and brand new 1990 data collected by the people at the University of Southern California. This indicates the incidence of power sharing practices in percent in those responding organizations. And recall that this is from a survey of Fortune 1000 companies, both manufacturing and service. And what we see is an increase in quality circles. We see an increase in groups other than quality circles, that's participation programs other than quality circles. We see an increase in union management quality of work-life committees, an increase in survey feedback, in job enrichment and redesign, but the most notable increase in this 3-year period is some 18 percentage points in the increase in self-managing teams. That's where most of the action has been occurring between 1987 and 1990 in terms of increased employee involvement activities on a group basis, not on an individual basis. But if you go back to the visual, what you can see is that very clearly what is still most common are employee involvement activities that focus on individuals, not on groups, and not on redesigning the way work is done. Still less than a majority of all companies have implemented, those responding have implemented self-managing teams. All right, now I have a second visual for you here, also from information presented to us this week by Ed Lawler, and this is on the incidence of pay practices, not employee involvement, but pay practices between 1987 and 1990. And here we see a marked increase in gain sharing from 26% of those organizations responding to 40%, profit sharing basically holding constant over the period, knowledge or skill-based pay increasing from 40 to 51% of the organizations, and the biggest increase, the use of flexible benefits by organizations. All right, so in terms of pay practices, that's what's happening in terms of the very recent study, still under analysis by the people at Southern California on the Fortune 1000 companies. Lawler suggests that the challenge is to move knowledge, information, power, and rewards down in organizations. He concludes that companies are doing okay on the first two of these, knowledge and information. They're doing less well in terms of moving power down in the organization, and frankly, he's not very pleased with the way organizations are moving rewards down in the organization. He sees a fairly significant problem there. And again, parallel participation is much more common than non-parallel participation, where we have workers being involved in groups. All right, let me move on and mention another study by Lawler. And this study concerns quality circles. And I'll go through this very briefly. Many of you may be familiar with this because this was also in a Harvard Business Review article in 1985. And so let me just mention it to you. Because many organizations have started their employee involvement efforts with quality circles. And if the objective is to increase employee involvement in decision making, then quality circles may be a good place to begin. They do have a number of advantages. One is that they're very easy to start up, but they also have a number of inherent flaws that may lead them to self-destruct. Lawler and Moorman have indicated that quality circles go through several phases: startup, problem solving, presentation and approval of solutions, the implementation of solutions, expansion and continued problem solving, and decline. And as Lawler indicates, and as co-author, quality circles have certain inherent features that make them difficult to sustain, and so therefore it's very easy for the quality circles to decline. So how can quality circles be best used by organizations? This article and these authors suggest quality circles should be best used in one of three ways. First, in terms of a group suggestion program. Second, in terms of special projects. Or third, in terms of making the transition from this type of parallel participation towards something like self-managed work teams. Now, it's very difficult to make that transition. In fact, very few companies have done it. Xerox, at their facilities in Rochester, New York, is one example, however, of a company that has been able to make that transition from a quality circle to something beyond a quality circle: autonomous work groups. What does employee involvement do? Let me share with you next some of the effects of employee involvement programs and participation. As you look at this next visual, you can see that from a recent study by the Brookings Institution, participation programs have the following effects. Participation usually has a positive impact on productivity, but however, the size and the significance of that effect is contingent on both the type of participation and on the environment the firm faces. Participation has a greater impact if it's participation that involves shop floor decisions, if it's substantive participation as opposed to cosmetic, if there's high commitment in the organization, and trust. And then finally, according to the researchers with the Brookings Institute, participation has the greatest impact if it's supported by gain sharing, by employment security, by reduced status differentials. And by that I mean things like the elimination of company cafeterias and company parking lots, and the elimination of things like this, jackets and ties in the workplace. And then finally, going back to the visual, very importantly, due process within the organization. All of these things, the Brookings Institute study finds, support very nicely employee participation within organizations. Moving along, what I'd like to talk about next are some legal issues, because frankly there are some real legal storm clouds on the horizon in terms of employee involvement, storm clouds that many of you may be aware of. What I'd like to mention is a couple of things. First of all, why we have this thing called the company union problem. The definition of a labor organization, unlawful domination or assistance, and then finally recent litigation involving DuPont. And I'll try to do that briefly. Congress, when they passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, the so-called Wagner Act, named after Senator Wagner from New York State, was concerned at that point in time with providing employees with a genuine method of determining whether or not they wanted representation. They were very concerned with organizations putting in what are known as company unions. And so they wrote into the National Labor Relations Act a couple of clauses that were intended to prevent company unions. One clause defines a labor organization. The second clause makes illegal unfair domination or assistance. Now, the problem is, in terms of employee involvement programs today, that employee involvement programs look an awful lot like labor organizations as defined in the National Labor Relations Act. And let me quote this for you. One section of the Act, Section 2.5, defines labor organization as the following: any organization of any kind or employee representation committee or plan in which employees participate and which exists for the purpose, in whole or in part, of dealing with employers concerning any number of items: grievances, labor disputes, wages, rates of pay, hours of employment, or conditions of work. Well, now that may sound a lot like your employee involvement organizations in your own organization. Needless to say, this is quite a broad definition. Looking more closely, however, we can see that employee involvement programs don't necessarily fall within this legal prohibition, because these programs may not act in such a way that employees participating in them have any sort of a representative capacity of their fellow employees. Now, I'm not a labor lawyer, although I teach labor law here at Virginia Tech, and so I'm not going to provide you counsel. But let me suggest to you that the recent cases have indicated that self-managed teams have been found not to be labor organizations under the National Labor Relations Act. So in terms of a labor organization, what a company has to keep in mind is that if the participation program looks like representation, where you have employees selecting other employees to be on the program, that may be a labor organization as defined by the National Labor Relations Act. That doesn't mean, however, it's automatically illegal, because it has to be unfairly dominated or assisted by the company for it to be a problem for the organization. All right? So you've got, first, the issue of, is it a labor organization? Second, is it unfairly dominated? Now let me suggest, however, the really critical problem, the storm clouds on the horizon, and that's some recent litigation involving the DuPont company. DuPont has had a couple of cases before the National Labor Relations Board recently, which are creating some problems not only for them, but for all organizations. What the National Labor Relations Board has basically been concluding in terms of employee involvement in non-union organizations is that they're basically going to let a lot of these things go as long as there's not evidence that they were put in so as to avoid unionization. At DuPont, however, in particular at one of their facilities, the Deepwater, New Jersey facility, the local independent union at that facility has been objecting to some employee committees. And that's caused some headaches for DuPont that other unionized organizations should be aware of. DuPont at their Deepwater, New Jersey facility put in what they called design teams that included supervisors and rank and file union members represented by this independent union. In late 1989, an administrative law judge for the National Labor Relations Board found these design teams to be unlawful. And at that point, DuPont did not contest the ALJ's decision, concluding that the design teams had basically served their purpose. They disbanded the organization and decided to let it go at that. However, the union at that facility, the Chemical Workers Association, has filed new charges. And sort of ironically, these charges are due to be litigated before an administrative law judge next week. The NLRB has alleged in a complaint that they have issued against DuPont that the company violated the National Labor Relations Act when they created committees composed of workers and supervisors to resolve workplace issues at this chemical plant. The National Labor Relations Board is alleging that the company used these groups to bypass the employees' union and to implement changes in working conditions at the plant. The union objected in this case, filing charges with the National Labor Relations Board because they claimed that the company was using the committees to weaken the union. They say that at the same time the company was dealing with these design teams, they were, dealing with the teams on health and safety issues, they were also refusing to bargain with the union over a number of the union's bargaining demands. The basic claim of the union, or the implication, the reason why I think this case is serious for employers, is that it raises a problem in particularly unionized organizations, and that is the following. Will an employee involvement program, such as what DuPont has put in, be illegal whenever the labor union objects? That may be the implication if the administrative law judge in this case finds for the union against DuPont. Now, that may create a fairly serious issue for companies. And again, I'm not a labor lawyer, so I don't necessarily want to project here. But if a company has to secure the union's approval before they can implement an employee involvement program, if the union, on the other hand, has the ability to go to the National Labor Relations Board and object whenever an employee involvement program is in place, then that obviously has some fairly serious implications for companies. Okay? And again, as I mentioned, this case is set for a hearing before an administrative law judge this very next week. All right? Well, now that concludes the first hour's presentation to this point.
We are now ready for questions from our audience out there who are watching the program today. Use the telephone number that is on your screen to call us if you have a question. We have a caller on the line. Go ahead, please.
Are job security guarantees really that important in building employee commitment to quality improvement?
Well, they seem to be from the evidence that we have to this point, for the following reasons: that if you're involving employees in a quality improvement program, it's going to be somewhat difficult to get employees fully involved in terms of making the kinds of changes in work practices, the kinds of changes in the restrictive work rules that may, for example, be present, the kinds of changes you may want in job design, if the employees are not guaranteed some form of employment security. Now, a very real question, just to elaborate on that for a second, is how are those employment security guarantees provided? Different organizations have different viewpoints on that, and one very real contrast is present in the auto industry, for example, between General Motors and the NUMMI joint venture out in California. General Motors has taken the position in their negotiations with the UAW that it's unrealistic for them to make any specific guarantees regarding any particular plant. They have guaranteed some overall employment numbers, but they've been unwilling to guarantee to the union that particular plants will be kept open. NUMMI, on the other hand, has worked very hard at, while they're not putting specific language in their contract, they have provided some assurances to employees. And in fact, when there have been downturns in production, they have reassigned employees, they've put employees into training, into maintenance functions, and they've been pretty successful to this point in avoiding layoffs. So I would answer that question by saying, yes, although it's difficult, any organization that's really committed to involving employees in quality improvement needs to think long and hard about how they can make some type of employment security assurance to the employees. Assurance, not necessarily a guarantee written in a collective bargaining agreement or in a personnel policy manual in a non-union company, but some understanding.
We have another question. Go ahead, please. Go ahead with your question, please.
Yes, sir. This question may sound isolationist or racist, but it's truly not intended that way. I guess the concern best expressed would be in terms of an analogy. What I'm speaking of is in the past 10 to 15 years, America seems to have been scrambling to incorporate many aspects of culture and business methods which have been perfected and proved successful in other countries, both to the east and west. It seems we've been attempting to transfuse them from the foreign body into our system, and we just might have a different blood type. In fact, we seem to be seeing some instances of rejection and adverse reactions it sometimes causes. Are we recognizing that the adaptations we are making might result in a mutant that could end up being weak or impotent compared to working to build our own uniquely American strengths? How can we be carefully selective, and have we looked far enough down the road to see if the new baby is going to turn out truly healthy or be deformed?
That's an interesting question, and it raises all types of interesting images in mind when you're talking about mutant babies. I think that the evidence is reasonably clear that while historically some of the attribution of the success of the Japanese companies has been to culture, that's really not the case. In an interesting study of the Japanese transplants in the United States, where we're taking Japanese management practices and they are competing successfully using American workers and not necessarily state-of-the-art technology, what we find in terms of an MIT study in particular is that it's not the Japanese culture, but it's a set of practices. Practices that presumably could be employed any place in the United States, Western Europe, Eastern Europe. And those are practices that emphasize two things. That emphasize new technology, yes, but that also emphasize the important role of human resources in such a way, blending technology and human resources so that continuous innovation is present. And so I might argue in response to you that it's not necessarily Japanese practices, although we unfortunately or fortunately use that terminology a lot of the time, but it's really a set of practices that should focus on continuous improvement and blending or meshing new technology, new management practices, human resource management in such a way that values education and training, for instance. I hope that answers your question.
We have another phone call. Go ahead, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I had a question in relation to the DuPont ruling that you were talking about at the end of your lecture, and I wanted to know if that idea that employee groups apart from the union should not be allowed to change workplace environment would also relate, would that ruling cross over to employees and unions covered under the National Railway Labor Act as well as regular unions?
That's a good question, and frankly, the National Labor Relations Act is not nearly as clear as the the Railway Labor Act is not nearly as clear as the National Labor Relations Act with respect to that issue. As you may be aware, the National Labor Relations Act, which covers most private sector employers, spells out unfair labor practices, whereas the Railway Labor Act doesn't really do a similar thing. And frankly, I'm not familiar with litigation under the Railway Labor Act which deals with the employee involvement area. For better or worse, I've tended to specialize more on the National Labor Relations Act, and I really couldn't give you a good answer to that question.
We've come to the end of our first question and answer period. We would like to take a 2-minute stretch break. Stand up, talk to your neighbor. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
Welcome back. I know we didn't give you a very great chance to get up and run to the restroom, but don't worry, that's coming up a little bit later. So I hope you had a chance to stretch your legs, and now we're going to dash back into the material. I understand we had somewhat more questions than we had in terms of calls in than we had time for, so we hope that you do call back during the next question and answer period. We've got about 40 minutes now of material, and the primary focus in this hour is going to be on cases of employee involvement in quality improvement. But before we get to that, I want to do one more thing, and that is to discuss the changing role of first-line supervisors and middle managers. This is a very important item, and so I want to take the first few minutes of this hour to review that. And let me mention at the outset that this is, or much of this material is drawn from a Department of Labor study authored by Janice Klein at Harvard University. And it, in a very interesting way, lays out some of the implications for the changes that are going on in management for first-line supervision and middle management. So let's turn to that material right now. This is the changing role of supervisors and managers. First, in terms of a basic introduction, let's just emphasize at the outset that plans and programs are simply rhetoric unless they're integrated coherently, that is, supporting the strategic focus of the company, and implemented properly. Experimentation with increased labor management cooperation at the strategic level, at the bargaining table, and most importantly at the workplace is having a major impact on the role and responsibility of first-line supervision and middle management. And that's occurring in both union and non-union organizations. These managers must facilitate the transformation in employment relations at the workplace on a day-to-day basis. These changes, however, in employment relations, in terms of the duties and responsibilities of first-line management and middle management, also come at a time, though, with changing technologies, new management philosophies, and especially new quality management and new materials management programs, things like TQM, Total Quality Management. Implementation, the point that we mentioned just a minute ago, ultimately rests on lower levels of management. Making employment relations changes or other manufacturing innovations, making those changes work requires that the needs of first-line supervisors and middle managers be considered and incorporated into the change process. Let's turn to the next visual. In terms of background, we need to recognize, first of all, now this may seem to be a common sense point, but frankly, when many companies are implementing employee involvement, it gets lost in the shuffle. First-line supervisors and middle managers are employees. The line between labor and management has been blurred in terms of new management practices with the delegation of traditional supervisory duties down to individuals and to work groups. Also with the inclusion of employees and unions in some instances in the making of strategic decisions. So this historic line under the National Labor Relations Act or the Fair Labor Standards Act, under most labor legislation between management and employee, that line has been blurred in many organizations. And we need to keep in mind that first-line management and middle management are employees as well when we're talking about employee involvement programs. Many times, middle managers and first-line supervisors are left out of the employee involvement process. They're the least protected, the least involved in innovations, but the most affected group within the organization. Organizations must consider managerial needs as well as employee needs when it comes to change within organization. Let's go back to the visual and look next at the changing role. There's been little change in the vast majority of American factories in terms of the role of first-line management. Historically, that is. But during the 1970s, some people argued that first-line supervisors were going to be a vanishing breed. With the introduction, it was argued, of work teams, autonomous work groups, supervisors were expected to delegate their duties away and to overemphasize, vanish into thin air, to phase themselves out of a job. Well, what has really happened? That hasn't exactly happened in most organizations, but we have seen some interesting trends. We've seen across most organizations an increase in the span of supervisory control. We have seen some downsizing in the ranks of first-line supervision, an increase in the span of supervisory control, which can only happen if we're pushing some responsibility downward within organizations. The worker-to-supervisor ratio does appear to be increasing. Now let's turn to the changing internal labor market, the next item on the visual. The trend in organizations appears to be back toward hiring college recruits for first-line supervision. And that trend, of course, has a whole set of pluses and minuses. Why is this happening? Well, one issue involves education. With the increasing educational level of the workforce, many organizations feel that they need increasingly educated supervisors. A second reason may be a perceived need to increase the quality, upgrade the quality of manufacturing management. Arguably, bringing college recruits in helps the organization there. Third is an assumption that, generally speaking, college recruits are more willing to change. They haven't brought the baggage with them into the organization that first-line supervisors promoted out of the ranks may have. Fourth, with increasingly sophisticated technologies, it's increasingly important that first-line supervision have these technical skills. And then finally, in many organizations, there's a lack of internal candidates that want the job, which leads to the organization turning to the colleges for first-line supervision. Now let's talk about some of the changes that occur within organizations as a result of, first, new manufacturing systems. New manufacturing systems require new skills on the part of their workers. Supervisors must possess new skills and abilities, ranging from technical knowledge of new manufacturing systems and equipment to better interpersonal skills. This list is likely also to include more managing skills, that is, planning and organizing. A second change involves the restructuring of tasks under quality of work-life programs, employee involvement programs, work organization. Although they may have, that is, the teams may have an excellent grasp of how the job works on a day-to-day basis, they often face technical problems which are outside their sphere of knowledge. Many teams also may find it difficult, unpleasant, if not impossible, to discipline their colleagues, so they need their first-line supervisor for that. They prefer to leave that to management. Another point worth mentioning here is that it's frequently difficult to translate classwork training, classroom training, into the workplace. That's a very difficult issue in a lot of organizations because the day-to-day reality of the workplace is frequently not very similar to a classroom setting, the kind of setting that many of you are in right now. How to translate the training that one receives for supervisors from the classroom into the actual organization, that's a real problem. All right? Next, the impact of worker or union participation on strategic decisions. The inclusion of workers or unions in the making of strategic decisions in many organizations has intensified the caught-in-the-middle feeling that supervisors have had. Those are some of the problems in terms of coping with changes that are raised for first-line management and middle management when we're introducing some of these new manufacturing processes and new management processes. Now let's turn to managing the innovation, managing the introduction of workplace innovations. Few organizations have the opportunity to start up with a new greenfield site with a totally new workforce or to recruit a completely new group of managers through college recruiting, for example. The vast majority of organizations need to modify their cultures, to institute change through their current management and their current workforce. Organizations need to view first-line supervisors and middle managers as both agents of change and objects of change. And one problem, of course, is resistance to change. Worker and supervisory resistance to change has been identified as the single most important problem, the single most important inhibitor in productivity improvement at the workplace. First line supervision in particular. Okay? Next. EI plus MI. And what that means is employee involvement plus managerial involvement. Many managers feel that employee involvement is the top telling the middle to do something for the bottom. Too often it's forgotten again that first-line management and middle management are employees as well as managers. Organizations introducing employee involvement need to keep in mind the involvement of their managers in the process. The next item is the issue of whether employee involvement is voluntary versus mandatory. Much of the early literature, particularly on quality circles, indicated that employee involvement should be a voluntary process, taking volunteers. Rarely, however, has it worked in a similar fashion for management, which raises a whole set of problems where management is ordered to participate in the innovation, whereas non-managers volunteer. One issue concerns rewards. If employee involvement is mandatory, that's one issue. But if managerial involvement is optional, well then how does the organization reward those managers? Where the involvement of the manager is optional, it creates a very real problem in terms of compensation and the reward structure for those managers. Next, managing the expectation of employees within the organization. A major problem in initiating change within an organization is assuming that everyone has the same understanding of the change that's in process. Semantics often get in the way in terms of the change process. Employee involvement may mean to some employees industrial democracy. Employee involvement may mean, on the other hand, to some managers listening to employees, but making their managerial decisions in much the same way that they always have. So managing expectations is one very real issue. And then finally, in terms of managing the introduction of innovations, training. Training is required not only for hourly employees, but for middle managers and supervisors as well. Unfortunately, the latter group, managers and supervisors, are frequently the last to be trained. And there are obviously two aspects of training. One is awareness training, basic exposure to the various forms that a new industrial relations system can take. A second level, however, of training is skills training, technical skills, interpersonal skills. Since most forms of employee involvement include some type of problem solving, lower levels of management must learn some basic problem solving techniques so that they can train their own group and lead their own group. Also, they may need training in making effective presentations, in running group meetings, in building consensus, and in resolving group conflict. Training that many first-line supervisors don't presently possess. All right? So in terms of basic implications, final point on the visual. We're moving from a view of lower management as the protector of managerial prerogatives to lower management as a liaison between the ranks, between operators or associates, and upper management. Not lower management as a protector, but lower management as a liaison. The second implication, just to repeat, there's a real need in many organizations for the training of first-line supervisors and middle managers. Training and development programs aimed specifically at them in terms of providing them with the skills they need to facilitate employee involvement. All right? Now that we've talked some about the implications for first-line supervisors and middle managers, I'd like to turn our focus to several cases of organizations which have involved employees in quality improvement. These are both non-union and union organizations, so that we all will have a sense of how organizations are proceeding in this area. And the first case that I'd like to speak about is a case involving the Welch Allyn Company. Welch Allyn is a privately held firm located in Skaneateles Falls, New York, which is upstate near Syracuse. It's 75 years old, and it employs some 1,200 employees. Welch Allyn manufactures and sells medical diagnostic instruments, barcode scanning and decoding equipment, and industrial inspection equipment. Their motivation to move in the direction of total quality was not based on a threat of competition, but based on a vision of opportunity, the vision of their CEO, Bill Allen. And this move toward total quality at Welch Allyn involved several phases. And I'm sharing this case with you because I think it outlines very nicely the importance of training and education in involving employees in quality improvement and moving toward TQM. The first phase involved awareness. Awareness building involved a number of steps by Welch Allyn, visiting other companies, attending seminars. There's a temptation on the part of many companies to buy a prepackaged training program that would address all of the knowledge and skills issues that are required to install total quality in the organization. Welch Allyn learned a very valuable lesson, and that is that there's no single quick recipe to make everything happen. You can't necessarily buy a prepackaged program, plop it down in your organization, and expect it to work. You basically need to custom design it for your own organization. Welch Allyn involved their process of awareness building involved a number of events. One of the first home events that they had was what they called a quality awareness training program for all employees. The objective of this training program was to develop a common understanding of what was meant by the term total quality, a common language, a common understanding of problem solving, and an introduction to the process of group problem solving, group interaction, the type of interaction that's required to support the concept of total quality. Welch Allyn also changed some of their visible symbols and their rituals. For example, posters appeared around the organization announcing the company's commitment to total quality. Also during this awareness building phase, committees were formed: a quality steering committee, a training committee, a recognition committee. All aspects of the business were open to examination: products, manufacturing, process, organizational procedures. They were all open to scrutiny. At the same time that awareness training was occurring, Welch Allyn was also conducting skills training, including courses in things such as blueprint reading, employee informational meetings on hazardous chemicals, and it became apparent reasonably quickly that some employees lacked the basic necessary reading skills and math skills to participate. And so Welch Allyn moved into a literacy training program. So as you can see here on the visual, a part of phase 1 was literacy training. Phase 2 involved quality skills training. It became apparent that total quality required employees who were educated and trained in a diverse range of knowledge and skills. This led to a changing in Welch Allyn's educational aid policy. It was revised and updated. The company fully pays for approved job-related courses and approved degree programs on a relatively lengthy list of items. These skills are periodically updated, and they include things such as English skills, machining, group behavior, just to mention 3, a very diverse set of skills that Welch Allyn has recognized that they need as they move toward total quality. Additions to the training programs at Welch Allyn have come from the needs of employees in participating in problem-solving teams. For example, they have increasingly trained workers in communications and group dynamics, in problem-solving skills also. Training starts at the top and includes the president and the executive staff and then cascades down in the organization. And that's an important lesson to take away from Welch Allyn, the importance of top management being involved, not only in endorsing the training, but frequently actually participating in the training. Welch Allyn's own employees are trained as trainers. The company uses their own employees, they use training facilities in their own building, but they also use, just to give you an idea of how extensive their training is, conference rooms in local hotels and even local church meeting halls. They have a lot of training going on, suffice it to say. The local community college also supports the training efforts. Their instructors teach many of the courses. Typically, these courses involve generic knowledge and certain skills training programs. Other courses, however, Welch Allyn has found are better taught by in-house trainers. Their experience is that when a manager is responsible for preparing and presenting some specific work-related training, the course will have more impact than if it's taught by someone like me, a community college instructor, or someone from outside the organization. So Welch Allyn is employing a lot of its own managers and own employees as trainers. The next step at Welch Allyn, phase 3, measurement, as they move toward total quality management. From the beginning, measurement was an important part of the commitment to total quality. Welch Allyn had been applying statistical process control for a number of years. The question behind measurement is obviously the need to know whether progress is being made. The company has developed a plan for a series of training programs in statistics. And very interestingly, they have the assistance in the development of this training program in statistics of the Center for Quality and Applied Statistics at the Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. That institute is assisting Welch Allyn in the presentation of these training programs in the area of statistics. Next, recognition, and celebration. Not only do you need to train workers, not only do you need to measure quality improvement, but Welch Allyn has also found that you need to recognize your accomplishments and celebrate them. And this includes at Welch Allyn a peer recognition program. The achievements that this company is most proud of to this point include reduced manufacturing costs, inventory reduction, and faster response time in filling customer orders. Organizational members at Welch Allyn have worked together to develop manufacturing cells and to implement a Kanban system. So these are all accomplishments that Welch Allyn is very pleased with, and they've been recognized and celebrated. Finally, in terms of Welch Allyn, what's next? Where do they go from here? Well, they have a number of things on their agenda, such as the expansion of the measurement of manufacturing processes and the formation of customer-supplier relationships. Also, the measurement of management processes is bound to become more important, they feel, especially, if you can imagine this, the measurement of leadership and the measurement of the process of empowering organizational members. You may be thinking at your own sites right now, how can we measure leadership? How can we measure empowerment? How can we measure these quote-unquote soft items? Welch Allyn is trying to develop measures for these. In addition, Welch Allyn has recognized that the linkage needs to be solidified between continuous improvement on the one hand and continuous training on the other hand. They need to work on that linkage. So that's where Welch Allyn is planning on going. To conclude, the management at Welch Allyn observes that the total quality movement in American industry appears to be redefining, maybe in a subtle way, the social contract between employers and employees. Management at Welch Allyn observes that moral values are changing in organizations, that ethical standards are changing in organizations, and that the reason this is happening is because total quality management assumes the pursuit of excellence in all aspects of the business, including items such as the company's moral values and ethical standards. Remember I said at the outset, at Welch Allyn, all aspects of the organization are open to scrutiny. So that's the Welch Allyn case. Now I'd like to turn to a second case involving a non-union company, and that is the Wallace Company. Wallace Company is a Houston-based pipe distribution company and the winner of the 1990 Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. The changes in the practices at Wallace Company that led to the Baldrige Award had their roots in a series of quality circles that were innovated and implemented back in 1985. These quality circles slowly evolved over time into something very different, into fully empowered quality improvement process teams, a network of teams at Wallace today, just as I mentioned in the first hour, I mentioned Xerox, and now here's a second company which has successfully managed the transformation of quality circles into something much more, into an actual team process. Wallace underwent a needs assessment back in 1987 which identified a number of things. That Wallace needed better communication, for one thing, more training, and a more positive atmosphere, a reduction in fear. They found that employees had been reluctant to discuss problems with managers. And so the company embarked on a comprehensive training program to deal with these needs that had been identified. And incidentally, a member of senior management at Wallace is always present when their associates receive training for either quality improvement skills or for job skills. And this helps deliver the message that training is important. So we've seen the emphasis on training at Welch Allyn, and now we see it at Wallace as well, with a member of top management being present for all training. Now here's an interesting development. The CEO at Wallace is a part of an innovative team set up last year when their human resource director left the organization. This human resource team includes not only the CEO, but a district manager, a sales representative, and the corporate product manager. They're supported, in terms of a staff function, by a human resource assistant. This management team was formed as a short-run response to a temporary problem, but they've had so much success with the team, this sort of stopgap human resource management team, that they now hope that this team will continue even after the hiring of a new human resource director. Speaking of teams, teams are important throughout the Wallace Company. It's estimated by the company that more than 80% of the day-to-day decisions that they make at Wallace are made through the team process. And training is, of course, also important. All associates at Wallace receive quality awareness training. Other training includes things like statistical process control, sales, customer service, coaching, leadership, communication, data collection skills, product knowledge, and cycle time reduction. A number of areas of training at Wallace. Many of the company's quality strategic objectives relate to human resource management. Objectives such as increasing quality skills training, for example, coaching techniques, and developing employee assistance programs. In terms of human resource performance, some of the measures one might imagine of how they're doing in terms of human resource performance, absenteeism has declined from 1.4% to 0.7%, which is less than half the industry average. Turnover has declined from 7% to less than 3%. Now, why did Wallace begin these efforts that resulted in their winning a Baldrige Award last year? These efforts began after one of Wallace's major customers, the Celanese Chemical Company, announced back in 1985 that it was consolidating its supplier base and that it intended to give its business only to those suppliers that were most reliable and that could furnish exactly what was needed, when it was needed. Wallace pledged itself back in 1985 to be such a supplier. Now, in turn, Wallace is demanding quality from the vendor end of the pipeline. They have trimmed the number of their suppliers, those companies that supply Wallace, from 3,000 to 300, and they plan to scale that number back to 200. So that was the impetus for quality improvement and the changes that have occurred in employee involvement at Wallace. Recall that teams are critically important at the Wallace Corporation. Now let's turn to a case right in our own backyard, Corning-Blacksburg. As you can see on the next visual, there are a number of elements to Corning-Blacksburg that I want to talk about. Their manufacturing strategy, keys for high commitment, organizational design, and the lessons that have been learned. Corning-Blacksburg illustrates the very tight linkage that's necessary between education, training, and workplace innovations that are necessary if you're going to involve employees in quality improvement. If you're not familiar with the story, I'll tell you a little bit about it. They've been very widely publicized recently. The Corning Company The Blacksburg plant in particular was mentioned in a cover story in Business Week magazine back in December. And then, as you may have seen, the CEO was the feature of a cover story just several weeks ago. The Corning Blacksburg plant reopened in 1989 when the company decided that they were going to use multi-skilled, team-based production in conjunction with automation in the manufacture of ceramic filters for catalytic converters. That's the product that's being manufactured down the road at Corning Blacksburg, the innards, if you will, of a catalytic converter. Corning's recruitment and selection process reflect an emerging trend in the management of human resources, particularly in the manufacturing center, and that is the trend of sifting through vast numbers of applicants to try to identify those most desirable workers. Corning Blacksburg, I'm told, sorted through some 15,000 applications to hire the 150 persons that they found to have the best problem-solving skills and the willingness to work in a team setting. Because this was basically a clean slate startup. The new hires at Corning Blacksburg received extensive training in both technical skills, interpersonal skills, and in the first year of production, 25% of all hours worked were devoted to training. The Blacksburg facility turned a $2 million profit during the first 8 months of operation, rather than losing the $2.3 million that had been projected during the startup phase. And the Blacksburg facility has performed so well that the company is proceeding with plans to implement the team technology in its other 27 manufacturing facilities. Corning has chosen to compete in world markets on the basis of a highly skilled, well-paid workforce, rather than cutting wages or outsourcing production or moving to offshore locations, lesser developed nations, for instance. This strategy, however, of competing with high-wage, high-skilled workers requires a huge training commitment. Corning's goal as a corporation is to devote 5% of all hours worked this year, 1991, to classroom training. 5%. Far more than the 1 to 2% figure, which is the average at most U.S. companies. Does this strategy work? This emphasis on high-wage, high-skilled workers? Well, it appears to be working for Corning in terms of increased product quality, increased productivity, increased performance, and bottom line measures. For example, Corning's return on equity increased from 9.3% in 1984, when they began to emphasize training, to 15.9% in 1989. It's no coincidence then that Corning's been featured on the cover of Business Week twice in the last 6 months. At the Blacksburg facility, the employees work some pretty demanding shifts, 12.5-hour shifts, basically alternating 3-day and 4-day weeks. It's not quite that simple, but I've been told that I can't understand exactly how they allocate their time. I know they work no more than 3 days in a row. Workers are divided into 14-member teams, and these teams make managerial decisions. They impose discipline on fellow workers, and they attempt to acquire a number of skills modules. The union, the American Flint Glass Workers Union, is cooperating with the company in their company-wide conversion to teamwork. The national union president of the Flint Glass Workers Union indicates that his members largely support this innovation, this shift to team-based production, because in turn they expect greater job security. With union approval, Corning has reduced the number of job classifications from some 50 job classifications at their Corning, New York facility to 1 classification for the operations associates here in the Blacksburg facility. This enables production workers to rotate jobs, to learn new skills. And the plant only has 2 levels of management. Now let me turn to the overhead again for a second. In terms of Corning's manufacturing strategy, it involves things such as improved equipment, small multiple lines and slower speeds, a simplified process flow, a continuous process flow, that is, cutting is a part of extrusion of their production method. And recall, we're talking about ceramic innards, if you will, of catalytic converters. It's a pull manufacturing system as opposed to push. They have no offline wear and process, and they have a clear line of sight. When you walk into that plant, you can basically see to the other end. In terms of their keys to high commitment, item 2 here on the visual, Corning has found that the keys to high commitment involve a redirected emphasis for rewards, power, information, and knowledge. Again, pushing these items downward in the organization. They've concluded that for high motivation and satisfaction, the individual must have a number of things: autonomy, variety and complexity in their job, feedback, task importance, and finally, continual improvement. Corning's goal at their Blacksburg facility is no visible differences in motivation between individuals and teams. No visible differences in motivation, no visible differences in terms of commitment to the organization. Next item on the visual is organization design. Corning Blacksburg has a flat organization design, 2 lines, 14 workers per team, as I mentioned, 4 shifts, continuous operation. They have no absolute or precisely defined job boundaries or work boundaries. They have mutual objectives, and those objectives are business focused, mutual objectives on the part of the associates and the leadership team. They emphasize a shared value or shared values and a shared culture. Their goal is to have complex jobs, jobs that are enriched. They have a very selective recruitment, as I've already mentioned. They have engineers that are coaches and trainers, not simply engineers, and they make the team responsible for operations, for business management, and for continuous improvement. And now finally, with respect to Corning, lessons learned. The lessons learned, and incidentally, these are lessons pointed out to me by John Yerrick, who's the member of the team responsible for employment relations at the Corning Blacksburg facility. The following lessons: that mission, values, and beliefs are key, and these must be constantly reinforced. Second, a problem. Expectations get set too high, and this frequently causes frustration and mistrust, much more often than either the leadership or the associates would like. The recruiting process is critical, but it's only 80% effective. And this is because, so John tells me, traditional baggage comes with everyone, especially a we-they mindset and a lack on the part of a few hires to assume responsibility. Multi-skilling has been proven at Corning Blacksburg to work. The team approach has been called by management there, leadership more correctly, awesome, particularly in terms of the bonding that occurs within the workplace. Employees at Corning Blacksburg expect the leadership to get their hands dirty and to participate. No sitting up in the front office. The layout of the plant is very important, particularly in terms of the early design, so that the manufacturing process goes hand in hand with the team system. Communicate, communicate, communicate. That's been emphasized to me whenever I visit Corning. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Both between leadership and the associates, from the associates to leadership. And finally, people expect to be involved at that facility. To conclude talking about Corning Blacksburg, it's a perfect example of a company which is trying to make its people its competitive advantage. To successfully compete in a global market, not by pursuing a low-wage strategy, by moving offshore or by outsourcing, but rather on the basis of quality, paying good wages to high-skilled workers by involving employees in the decision-making process. Let me just mention for you, as we wrap up this second hour of the program, several other cases that you may be aware of companies that are successfully involving employees in quality improvement. One additional example is Gravely International, a manufacturer of top-end, high-quality lawn care equipment. They have a manufacturing facility outside of Winston-Salem, down in North Carolina. It is a unionized facility, and they've been quite successful in terms of employee involvement. Their employees, for example, have designed or redesigned the assembly line system, each individual basically assisting in the design of their own workstation. So Gravely is an example of a company that's also competing on the basis of quality. High-skill employees not moving offshore. Another example, maybe one of the best examples in the literature, is the Xerox Corporation that we previously mentioned, located, at least its home manufacturing facility, in upstate New York, outside of Rochester. Xerox has been a leader in terms of involving employees in all areas of decision-making, in terms of bringing employees from quality circles into the team system, and they are worth recognizing. And then finally, in terms of other cases of note in our own backyard, GNB Incorporated and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, located over in Lynchburg, they have quality circles and employee involvement groups in their manufacture of auto batteries. Philip Morris in Richmond, with both the bakery workers and the machinists union. And then just down the road in Roanoke, Shenandoah Life, with very innovative team systems in a service industry, in the life insurance industry. And so these cases illustrate how employee involvement in quality improvement is possible in big companies, in small companies, in manufacturing, and in service. And that concludes the second hour of the presentation.
We're now ready for questions from our audience again. If you use the telephone number that is on your screen, please call us and ask questions of our presenter. We have a caller on the line. Go ahead, please.
Yes, when Corning in Blacksburg reopened, why didn't the company try to stay non-union like a lot of other companies are doing?
Well, that's an interesting question. Corning had been a unionized organization here in Blacksburg. Most, if not all, of their other facilities are unionized as well. And so when Corning was reopening their facility in 1989, they had a decision to make. And I certainly wasn't there, but as I understand it, the outcome of their decision was to work with their employees in the form of a labor union so as to prove for their company that they could implement, on basically a greenfield, clean slate basis, they could successfully implement this very innovative team system. And so they've worked very closely with the labor union. And in fact, if you look at their organizational chart, they don't really have one, but what they have, the union president is right there at the same level of the organization as the team leader or the member of the leadership team who does the employment relations. And so Corning's strategy was to work with their labor union as opposed to trying to reopen this Blacksburg facility on a non-union basis. And although the jury is still obviously not in, we've got basically 2 years of experience, and it seems to be a real go to this point.
We have another caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes. How will this TQM lend itself to classified employees at government agencies?
Well, again, I think the basic issue is involving employees in decision-making. And while some of the discussion, or much of the discussion, is on production, particularly in manufacturing, if you think back to what I mentioned during the very first hour, the philosophy that's present in the organization is employee involvement a part of quality improvement or vice versa. What I'm really talking about here is fundamentally changing the way the organization views employees, moving from controlling workers to securing commitment from workers. And that can happen in any organization.
We have another caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Greetings from the far north. This question comes from our group at Badenoch Community College up in Escanaba, Michigan. We're pleased to be serving as one of your conference sites. Our question: in most cases, self-managing work teams, job redesign, and even game-sharing concepts don't sit well with unions and traditional plants. Should all manufacturing companies drive through the resistance, if necessary, to survive in the 90s?
That's a tough question, but it's probably the best question, and I'm going to say that because I'm a Michigan native, so obviously the Michiganders in the audience are asking the best questions. That's a really tough question because a lot of the traditional adversarial relationships do result in the labor union opposing the innovation. We were very fortunate here this week in Blacksburg to have not only Ed Lawler, as I mentioned previously, but two members of top leadership at the Saturn facility in Spring Hill, Tennessee. And the Saturn facility, as I'm sure you're aware, really represents perhaps the farthest reach of joint union management cooperation, joint union management innovation. And I asked the local union president, that's not his official title, but that's basically what he is, Mike Bennett, his reaction to the New Directions movement within the UAW. And as you probably are aware, organized labor in this country is of not a like mind in terms of the utility or the usefulness of employee involvement programs. But the people at Saturn are genuinely committed to this. And the people in a number of unions are genuinely committed to it. And I think what management has to do is to try to reach common ground with their employees. Again, union or non-union. To illustrate to employees that you have mutual concerns, that while there may be some conflict of interest between employees and management, the success of the firm is very much an interest of the employees. And if you can sit down with your employees, regardless of whether they're represented by a labor union or not, and illustrate the competitive situation, to illustrate the mutual concerns, and to illustrate how management can work with employees and employees with management to meet the competitive challenge, then you may have a winner on your hands. But I think, frankly speaking, there are always going to be some unions that don't trust management for whatever reason and are not going to be willing to work with management. And when that's the case, you've obviously got a real problem on your hands, and few of us, no matter our background, have a good answer to that question.
Will the next caller go ahead, please?
Hello? I'm calling from Winchester, Virginia, and the speaker made a comment about absenteeism at the Wallace Company going down from 1.4% to 0.7%.
Yes.
And indicated that that was half the national industry standard. What goes into that number of what constitutes absenteeism and how is it measured?
I can't report the specifics of that to you. That's a figure that I've seen cited, and I think it would simply not be responsible of me to try to indicate to you what goes into that figure. So I apologize for that. I don't think I can really deal with that question.
We have another caller on the line. Go ahead, please.
How can employee literacy be improved when, for example, the local union prohibits more than 3 hours of course work per year?
The local union prohibits more. Well, I have no idea why the local union would want to do that. I certainly wouldn't counsel my friends in the labor movement to do that, but you've got a very real issue. A lot of organizations have problems with employee literacy, and the ones that are meeting those problems involve the union in dealing with the literacy question. I mentioned Gravely International, for example, and that's a case where their unionized employees or their labor union very actively participated in improving the literacy of their employees. And so if you have a situation where the local union is restricting the number of hours of education that the employees can acquire, I think it's time for a frank discussion of the realities of the workplace between management and the local union.
We have another caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I'm calling from the beautiful island of Bermuda, and we have a question for you here. In many organizations, employees are recognized through promotion and salary increases. Can you please elaborate on how employees are recognized in some of the examples you've just provided? Thank you.
Sure. Let me again choose Corning Blacksburg as one and the NUMMI facility as a second. And in those organizations, status within the organization has been shifted so that it's a function of skills acquisition And I think that's the direction that we may want to be moving more and more toward. I mentioned previously, several times actually, that Ed Lawler was here this week. He is arguing very strongly for shifting compensation and rewards, for example, to performance, both individual performance, but also group performance and company performance. And so my response to that question, and of course Bermuda is second only to Blacksburg in terms of its scenic beauty, my response to that question would be that we need to move rewards and recognition toward skills acquisition, not the job that the employee has per se, but the skills that they have and the knowledge that they possess.
This brings us to the end of our second question and answer period. We will now take a 15-minute break. We'll be back in 15 minutes to conclude our teleconference seminar for today. Welcome back to the last part of our seminar. Dr. Partridge will now discuss with you strategies for implementation.
Welcome back. In this last hour, as Stan has mentioned, our focus is going to be on how you actually do some of the things that we've been talking about for the first 2 hours in your own organizations. And we've had a sufficient number of phone calls we haven't had a chance to get to that we're going to go to the question and answer period a little bit earlier than planned, so be aware of that. At about 2:40 we'll be going to the questions and answers. All right? I'm going to talk first about something that may seem strange to you, and that is employee involvement at Eastern Airlines. Now, you may be asking yourself, why are we talking about Eastern Airlines? That's certainly not a company that comes to mind when I think about employee involvement and labor management cooperation. But my point with starting for Eastern is that sometimes we can best learn about strategy implementation from failures. And so at Eastern Airlines, we see an employee involvement strategy that did not work. It's frequently easy, given the demise of Eastern Airlines, however, to overlook the fact that Eastern was praised as recently as 1984 for having very innovative employee involvement programs. In fact, there was even an article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review trumpeting Eastern's accomplishments in terms of being very innovative in the area of employee involvement, and I might mention also union management cooperation. Employee involvement at Eastern Airlines was, first of all, a program that emphasized productivity improvements and quality of work life improvements. But it grew and grew until eventually it involved a much larger vision that required a major change in cultural values at Eastern. The pushing of authority downward in the organization, something that we mentioned repeatedly, and ultimately the sharing of power between labor and management. The reasons for the downfall of employee involvement at Eastern will be instructive for, I would hope, your organization. First, strikes against employee involvement. Separation from the corporate structure. It's frequently the practice, as I've alluded to previously, to introduce the cooperative idea in a structure that's parallel to but separate from the rest of the organization. In this way, it can develop in neutral territory, somewhat protected between, in Eastern's case, turf battles between union and management. However, the problem is it can also there be ignored. If at Eastern Airlines employee involvement had been more integrated into the corporate structure, it couldn't have been dismissed as easily, and souring labor management relations wouldn't have had as big an impact. So one of the first lessons that we learn from Eastern Airlines is the problem of separating the employee involvement program from the rest of the corporate structure. A second lesson, a strike against employee involvement at Eastern Airlines, involved the separation of employee involvement from collective bargaining. Another standard practice is this separation of employee involvement from collective bargaining. In theory, the separation makes sense. If nothing else, it eases the union's worry and management's worry that they might lose control over some issues that are important to them. These people off in this quality circle out here aren't going to do anything too radical. In practice, however, it's hard to make the separation between involvement and the collective bargaining process complete, and it may be unwise. For instance, an employee involvement program is likely to bring up issues that affect the collective bargaining agreement. Not allowing the employee involvement group, a quality circle, for example, in an initial startup, to wrestle with matters like work rules might be missing an important opportunity. So that's an issue, separating employee involvement from collective bargaining. A third issue, there was a strike against employee involvement at Eastern, is geographic diffusion. And by this I mean, the major issue at Eastern was whether the concepts of cooperation should be introduced all at once across the entire organization, or in one department or one station, one workplace. Eastern's external consultants argued that in large companies, the concept of cooperation and employee involvement is best introduced on a small scale in one department or at one location. But Frank Borman, who was then CEO, whom I'm sure you all remember as an astronaut, insisted that employee involvement had to be introduced everywhere through Eastern Airlines, all at once or not at all. And as it turned out, employee involvement was successful at Eastern Airlines in particular locations and in particular departments because it's a process that requires solid and continuing support. Employee involvement worked at Eastern Airlines in some places, but the scale of the company was simply too broad for it to be successfully implemented everywhere at once. The next strike against employee involvement at Eastern Airlines involves diffusion across work groups. This involves how to spread participation to different work groups. This problem is best illustrated at Eastern in the case of pilots. And before I forget, I should probably mention to you that Eastern Airlines is a not bad example of employee involvement in the service sector. We tend to emphasize a lot employee involvement programs and quality improvement in manufacturing. Eastern, of course, is in the business of serving customers. And so it's really a service example. Back to the pilots. Pilots, as you might imagine, their background doesn't really lend itself to consensus-based problem-solving or decision-making. It didn't fit well with the sort of itinerant existence that pilots have, or with their frequent military training and background. The problem was, instead of encouraging a different but suitable employee involvement path for the pilots, the common employee involvement program at Eastern basically told them that they had failed to develop a problem-solving approach. The lesson is that in any organization, such as Eastern or maybe your company, any organization with diverse work structures, you must design a participation program that fits the particular employee's needs and limits. The next strike against employee involvement at Eastern involves coordination of the programs. It's generally accepted that employee involvement requires a culture of participative management and vice versa. Employee involvement and participative management are flip sides of the same coin, according to the Ford Motor Company. In fact, they have a neat little thing. They've had coins printed up where they have employee involvement on one side and participative management on the other side. That's required, generally speaking. Many managers at Eastern Airlines received introductory education and some awareness sessions designed for managers before the employee involvement training began, but they were one-day sessions, and they really couldn't do very much in terms of actually training managers to be participative managers. Therefore, when employee involvement got off the ground, there wasn't an adequate participative management culture in place. After the fact, too little too late, the company offered much more intensive 5-day seminars for participative management. But by then it was too late. It would have been best if this intensive management training had been coordinated and in fact had coincided with the employee involvement team training of the pilots and the machinists and the flight attendants. That illustrates the point of the importance of the coordination of programs, particularly managerial training and line training, if you will. Finally, in terms of strikes against employee involvement at Eastern, reinforcement of training. The intensive participative management training that I just mentioned brought together managers from all over Eastern systems, managers that were basically isolated from one another. It brought them together for training, and then it sent them back to their respective workplaces where no one could reinforce the training that they had received. These managers, participants in the training program, gained an understanding of the benefits of participative management, but there was no follow-through to reinforce that training. And the result was, as you might expect, the training did not take hold. In contrast, on the other hand, the employee involvement training of the non-managers was very effective regarding reinforcement. When the people finished employee involvement training, they went back to their workplaces where there was an established system in which they could practice what they had learned. Action teams, those were the teams at the workplace, met weekly. They researched and solved problems. They made presentations to management in order to get their identified solutions implemented. These action teams reinforced the principles and the skills that the people at Eastern had learned in their training. So reinforcement of training, when we're talking about strategies for implementing employee involvement, reinforcement of training is another lesson that we learned from Eastern Airlines, something that wasn't done adequately at Eastern. Let's move on then from some specific issues involving strikes against employee involvement at Eastern to some more general issues. The first issue here involves the role of leadership. The leadership of both the company and the union did not focus their efforts on the mutual changing of cultural values. Although leaders on both sides said they needed to change their culture, neither side walked their talk. They never really believed there were cultural problems in the first place. And so they didn't put any effort into solving those problems. Consultants in the field of labor management cooperation and employee involvement agree that leadership is absolutely crucial to the success of employee involvement. If a mature culture, organizational culture, is not functioning well because of a mismatch between the culture and its environment, it requires a leader, not simply a manager, but a leader to guide that change. So the role of leadership was an issue at Eastern. A second issue involves the coordination of consultants. There were two sets of consultants at Eastern Airlines for political reasons, but no one was in charge of coordinating them to make sure they supported each other. The result was that they developed in opposite directions. As should be obvious, this is not a good approach. All right? Next, performance and reward in terms of general issues. A major issue in participation programs is how the creators of ideas should be rewarded for their ideas. During the period of quality circles at Eastern, the company maintained that quality circles work was simply a part of the employee's regular job for which they were already paid. So therefore, they should not be further rewarded for their ideas. The company claimed that the rewards should be intrinsic rather than extrinsic. Improvements in the product, in communications, in the quality of the employee's job, rather than monetary compensation. In other words, participants in quality circles or employee involvement should be rewarded by their pride in a job well done and by the improved working conditions that they experience rather than by some percentage of cost savings. Now at Eastern, the Machinists Union disagreed with this and withdrew from the Quality Circles program, at least in part due to this problem. Now many scholars of employee participation would be sympathetic, somewhat at least, to the union's position in this case, arguing that some form of savings of costs should be shared. But there is some evidence at Eastern that supports the company's position. But that's not really the question. The question is, if you assume that employees should be compensated for their ideas, how should that be done? That's the major question that your organization may need to face. If employees should be compensated, how should it be done? Should individuals receive rewards for their ideas, such as in a suggestion system? Or should an entire work group share in the gains from someone's idea? Or should the entire workforce share the gains? At Eastern, it was argued that sharing gains over the entire workforce would encourage cooperation both among individuals and among groups. And it was argued that that was the best way to go. But that's an issue that you need to address: individuals, groups, or the entire workforce. Another question that's particularly relevant in the service sector is whether participants should be rewarded only for cost savings ideas or for revenue generating ideas as well. Although it might be harder to measure the value of revenue generating projects, it would be worth the effort in a company like Eastern, where so many line employees are in constant contact with their customers. Aside from the issue of measurement, there's no reason that revenue generation should be excluded from a gain-sharing program. All right. The next general issue involves the persistence of ideologies. In spite of all of the attention that was given to the changing of the way of doing things at Eastern, the traditional ideologies of both the union and management leadership really survived basically intact. In order for the experiment at Eastern to become more than just another short-lived Eastern program, Eastern was one of these companies suffering from programitis, their people would have had to have questioned their beliefs and to change them if necessary. Instead, management and union felt they had been right all along. And then finally, in terms of general issues, the influence of external forces. These forces encouraged Eastern's leaders to focus on quick fixes in terms of, quick fixes rather than long-term solutions. And that's the final general issue. Very difficult in an organization to focus on the long haul. And at Eastern Airlines, if you're familiar with that situation, deregulation was happening. They had companies like People Express snapping at their heels. And so the focus of the organization shifted from the long-term to short-haul problems, and that in part contributed to the demise of Eastern Airlines and employee involvement at Eastern Airlines. Now let's move from Eastern Airlines, a service company, to a very different example, and to try to learn some lessons from the Ford Motor Company's Sharonville plant. The Ford Motor Company's Sharonville plant has been one of the most visible examples of employee involvement. And I'd like to share with you next 9 lessons that can be learned from the Sharonville plant. First, highly visible interest and commitment of top management is crucial to the implementation of the participation effort. This should come as no surprise. This is pretty conventional wisdom in terms of the employee involvement literature. Highly visible interest, commitment, quite important. Second, the appointment of a co-coordinator from hourly's ranks provides further evidence of management's interest and support in the program. Third, the support and active participation of union representatives and members of the Joint Union Management Committee is a must. This obviously is particular to a unionized organization, and it suggests that where the union is sitting on the sidelines, letting employee involvement go, that may create some problems. Fourth, national level support is important for plant level actions. Here we're talking obviously about multi-plant or multi-workplace locations. And if you don't have support from the top national leadership, both within a union, in an organized company, and from management, there are going to be some problems in terms of employee involvement. And keep in mind while we're walking through this list that what we're trying to do is to identify roadblocks or hurdles, if you will, for the successful implementation of employee involvement in your organization. Fifth, keeping collective bargaining issues separate from the involvement process is essential. Or is it? The reason why I raised the question here is because the first people who looked at the Ford experience looked at the separation of employee involvement from the rest of the organization, this parallel participation structure that I mentioned, and they argued that that was very important for the success of employee involvement. I suggested, however, to you a little bit previously that this may create some problems. And I think the evidence is at this point that this is not essential. It is not essential to separate employee involvement from the collective bargaining issues in the long haul. It may be necessary in terms of the startup, but I think you have to recognize that fairly quickly in a unionized organization, employee involvement teams are going to become interested in issues that impact on the collective bargaining agreement. And if you have this artificial wall between a quality circle or any type of employee involvement team and the collective bargaining agreement, you're really hamstringing the kind of creativity that that team can produce. So that's one change that we've had in terms of the lessons learned. Sixth, starting on a small scale with pilot groups is useful. Now let's not get confused here. We're not talking about pilot groups as in Eastern Airlines. We're talking about pilot employee involvement groups. And unlike Eastern Airlines, the evidence indicates that management is well advised to develop employee involvement at the outset in terms of experiments, and then to try to diffuse these experiments throughout the workplace rather than trying to cover the whole 9 yards at once. Moving on, the seventh lesson, problem-solving training is not necessary up front, but as needed. There may be a question in your organization as to where should you put the training. And the lesson learned from the Sharonville plant at Ford is that problem-solving training can be provided to the employees as the teams or the groups or the quality circles proceed. You don't necessarily have to do that all up front, because I think, frankly, you'd have problems in terms of transfer from the classroom to the workplace if you did that. It may be most useful to get the teams going, or the circles going, or the committees going, get them involved in tackling some problems, and then, once they've run into some frustrations, provide them with some problem-solving, decision-making training. Eighth, gain sharing is not necessarily important immediately, because in the short run, things such as job security payoffs and simply the value of participation, intrinsic rewards, motivate the workers. But in the long run, however, the evidence is pretty clear that gain sharing is needed to sustain efforts. And recall again from the Eastern case, we're talking about gain sharing not only in terms of cost savings, but also arguably in terms of revenue generating suggestions. Again, the evidence is reasonably clear that to sustain employee involvement over the long haul, gain sharing at some point is needed. And then finally, ninth lesson from the guest study, don't forget middle and lower management. That reinforces our previous discussion of the changing roles of first-line supervision and middle management. So those are 9 lessons from the Ford Sharonville study. To move on, let me provide you with a different list, another list. Guidelines to employee involvement implementation. And let me say something very quickly about each of these 8 things. Again, this is particular to not necessarily particular to a unionized organization, but it certainly starts with a unionized organization. And that is, if we can move to the visual, first, union and management support. Now, this may seem to be reasonably basic, but we need to keep in mind that if you don't have union and management support, the employee involvement program may not go very far. Secondly, the guidance of a joint steering committee. Quite important for employee involvement, particularly in a unionized setting, that you have some type of joint labor management steering committee that's overseeing the entire process. Third, diagnosis of the organization. Here the issue is to determine the readiness of the organization for employee involvement. And that involves identifying factors that would either facilitate employee involvement or impede employee involvement. Facilitate or impede. Pluses and minuses in terms of whether the organization is ready for employee involvement. Furthermore, this diagnosis of the organization should provide you with some benchmark factors. We've mentioned previously the importance of measurement. Measurement not only in the attainment of technical production objectives, but also measurement of the soft things. Measurement of things like leadership skills and the empowerment of members in the organization. So when the organization is conducting the diagnosis of the organization to determine the readiness of employee involvement, you'll essentially be developing three things: pluses and minuses, strengths and weaknesses, things that will either help you or inhibit employee involvement in your organization, but also you'll be developing, thirdly, benchmark data. How are you doing so far in terms of power, rewards, information, knowledge? Items such as those. Fourth guideline to employee involvement implementation: selection of a pilot site. And this is, of course, important. If you follow the strategy that you want to start small and work your way up, you'll need to identify a pilot site. And probably this pilot site is going to be one where you're pretty sure the experiment is going to take hold. Because you don't want to identify as a pilot site the toughest nut to crack. That's not necessarily going to do the organization any good. So you want to identify as a pilot site for employee involvement a work group or a department where you have a suspicion from the diagnosis of the organization that you've got a reasonable chance of making employee involvement go in that area. Then once you have that model within the organization, that can be taken and applied in other areas. Fifth, preparation of the organization. And here, most importantly, what's required is education to dispel misperceptions. If you recall back to the second hour, I mentioned the Corning-Blacksburg example, where despite the fact that they're doing quite well, they have identified the issue of inflated expectations as being a very serious one for them. And so in terms of preparing the organization for employee involvement, what's quite important is getting everyone on the same page in terms of what employee involvement is and what employee involvement isn't. You don't necessarily want your employees, for example, believing that it's going to be complete industrial democracy if that's not what you're intending. If you're intending a parallel participation structure such as a quality circle or some type of joint labor management committee, that's not an autonomous work team. And you don't want employees to be perceiving that too much is going to be delivered. The final three steps are basically self-explanatory. Initiation of the pilot project, following the selection of the site and the preparation of the organization, evaluation and fine-tuning, and then finally, assuming that it's working reasonably well, the expansion of the employee involvement program to other areas, or the term that's sometimes used, the diffusion of employee involvement throughout the organization. So those are 8 guidelines to employee involvement implementation, which hopefully your organization will be able to use. The next item that I'd like to speak about is some factors that have been identified as common to successful employee involvement efforts. And these, again, come from the previous study that I've mentioned, done by the American Productivity and Quality Center. So let's look at these 5 factors. First, leadership. Now, this may seem to be repetitive or redundant, but I'm simply trying to emphasize from a variety of different sources the lessons that have been learned regarding employee involvement. And at the top of the list in the APQC study is leadership. Employee involvement doesn't fly unless management sees a business need for it. employee involvement will not go unless management sees a business need for it, such as integrating employee involvement with quality improvement. Management support must start at the top and permeate throughout the organization. And that may involve things, as we've seen from the other cases, things as simple as top management attending training programs to send the signal to employees of the value of training. We learned another lesson from Eastern Airlines that I didn't mention previously, and that was the importance of top management's commitment to employee involvement. Frank Borman got turned on to employee involvement when he visited Boeing, and he saw the highly motivated union workers at the Boeing company out in Seattle. And he said to them, "I want this." And as long as Frank Borman was interested in employee involvement, as long as he put a priority on it, management below him did likewise. But when Frank Borman became disenchanted with employee involvement, because frankly it wasn't producing the bottom line results as quickly as he wanted, he lost commitment. Middle management lost commitment, and that trickled down in the organization. So leadership is very important. A second factor common to successful employee involvement efforts involves intensity. The literature indicates to us that the impact of employee involvement efforts are strongly related to the number of high involvement practices that are implemented in the organization. High-performing companies use more employee involvement practices than do lower-performing companies. They use more approaches in areas such as information, knowledge, power, and rewards. And they use those approaches with a larger percentage of the workforce. So intensity is a second factor common to successful employee involvement efforts. The use of a number of different employee involvement approaches dealing with information, knowledge, power, and rewards. A third factor common to successful employee involvement efforts is longevity. Very simply, employee involvement does not come quickly. I mentioned at the top of the program the recent GAO study that indicated that quality improvement processes took 2.5 years on average to really reach bloom. Employee involvement is not going to be an overnight growth product either. Getting employee involvement going can be a long, arduous process. Many companies lose enthusiasm and commitment when the going gets tough, when they discover how difficult the transition is from control to commitment. Frank Borman is one example at Eastern Airlines. Next, normalization. A rather technical term, but here's what it means. Successful efforts are more likely to build employee involvement considerations into policies, into procedures, into written objectives, and into formal measurements within the organization. And they're more likely to have a special corporate office within the organization to help guide the transition and report to the CEO. That's what we mean by normalization. Not this parallel structure, but the incorporation of employee involvement into measurement systems and reward systems, policies, procedures, written objectives, and formal measurements. To what extent has the organization empowered employees? Again, one of those soft measures. And then finally, fifth, in terms of factors common to successful efforts, for those unionized organizations, something that should be obvious, union involvement. High-performing companies that have unions are more likely to have involved them than not. High performers are also more likely to have a contractual clause addressing the employee involvement effort. So union involvement, obviously, is a fifth and final factor that's important for successful employee involvement in a unionized organization. Well, now that completes the third presentation, the third segment, and we're now ready to go to more questions and answers.
We're now into our final question and answer session. You may want to ask questions about any of the ideas that you've heard this afternoon, or specifically on the third segment on strategies. We're ready to receive your questions. Do we have a phone call? We have a caller on the line. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Could you please tell me how important are consultants in implementing employee involvement?
Well, now that's an interesting question. I think that generally speaking, a consultant may well be useful, but a company doesn't want to over-rely on consultants. I mentioned in the second hour the example of Welch Allyn, which is doing a lot of the training in-house, where they're training their own employees to do training. And I think that's very important. I don't think that a company wants to rely on a consultant any more than they need to, but on the other hand, it might be useful to have an independent party coming in. I think the problem that many organizations may run into is that, at least my observation, is that consultants often create the demand for their products rather than reacting to the demand for their products. Looking at the most recent convention agenda for the Society of Human Resource Management, for example, which is going to be in Cincinnati in a couple of weeks, I was struck by the number of presentations at the SHRM conference that are being, or that will be presented by consultants. And it's probably not completely the case that they're there simply to provide information to companies, but rather, of course, they're trying to identify new customers as well. So you don't want a consultant who is going to try to sell you a bill of goods that you don't need.
We have another caller. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you're aware of any studies which would show the effects of two variables on the success of employee involvement. One of those is whether the group chooses the topics or whether management hands the topics to the employee involvement group. The second is the use of the Deming approach on controlling the process versus controlling the product.
First things first. I'm not aware of evidence regarding either item. And if there are studies, then I apologize for not being aware of it. But I'll give you my impression regarding the first item in particular. And that is that I think that it's very important for the team to be building its own agenda. At most, I think the team and the leadership team need to identify a common agenda. But I would fear that if management is dictating items to the team, that the approach is going to be much less successful. And regarding the Deming method, as I mentioned, I'm not aware of literature regarding the effectiveness of that approach in terms of the team approach to employee involvement.
Will the next caller go ahead, please?
Yes, I'm calling from Wichita, Kansas, and I would like to know if progressive discipline could be integrated into a quality group successfully.
Are you asking? Well, you probably can't. You probably can't answer the follow-up. But let me say something about progressive discipline versus positive discipline, because that is an approach that's being used in many organizations. You're all familiar with progressive discipline, the notion that as the misbehavior continues, that increasingly stiffer penalties should be imposed. And there's a relatively new development in employment relations, human resource management, known as positive discipline, which frankly is something that a lot of managers are somewhat uncomfortable with. The notion that you don't actually impose discipline, but rather that you counsel an employee and try to have them learn the error of their ways and eventually come around to changing their behavior. I somewhat liken it tongue-in-cheek to the notion of sending your son or daughter to their bedroom to think about what they've done wrong rather than an alternate approach. I think, frankly, in terms of where we're headed, going from commitment to control in the workplace, that a positive discipline approach is somewhat more consistent with eliciting commitment, but that's not to say that a progressive discipline approach would not work in a team environment. If I haven't answered that question, feel free to call back and try to make it more clear for me.
We have another caller. Please go ahead.
Go ahead.
Hello. Hi, we're calling from Bermuda again. We have a group of bankers in our midst this afternoon. We're wondering if you have any very good examples that we could use in the banking industry for quality service or for the team experiences that you're talking about. Do you have any examples that we could use?
I'm not intimately familiar with examples of teams in the banking industry, but I would suggest to you that one company to contact might be Signet Bank, based in Richmond or operating out of Richmond. Robert Bryant is a top manager of Signet Bank, an executive vice president in the human resource area at Signet, and they are doing a number of very innovative things. And I suspect, although I don't have hard data, that they're doing things in this area as well. I had also mentioned in the last hour Shenandoah Life. Although that's not banking, it is in the insurance industry, a similar work process, and they've been doing very innovative things.
We have another caller. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yes.
Go ahead.
How you doing?
Go ahead with your question, please.
Go ahead with your question. I guess we've lost that caller. Will the next caller go ahead, please? I guess we've lost our caller who was on the line. I guess we have no more calls. Do you have some final advice to give us this afternoon?
Yes, why don't I go back to one thing that I didn't have time for in this third hour. If we can refocus the camera on the visuals, let me mention some dilemmas that have been raised in one last case. Dilemmas, again, particular to the unionized sector that a company may want to keep in mind, those organizations out there that are unionized. And this comes from a study of a General Motors plant in their relationship with a United Auto Workers local. Dilemmas and implications. And I think this is a nice closing note for today's program. The first item is this question: what is a constructive union management relationship? Much of the attention of labor relations academics, such as myself, and practitioners during the last 2 decades has been focused on the development of cooperative union management relationships. Many of the people at this particular plant, located in Willow Run, Michigan, the General Motors Hydromatic plant, many of the people at that plant believed their plant would not survive unless union and management cooperated. Yet, despite that, many voted against their former local union president, in part because he was viewed as being too close to management. It might be argued that what is needed between union and management is not a relationship which is cooperative or adversarial, but rather a constructive relationship where the parties use skills of both modes: cooperative, mutual labor relations, but also some adversarial labor relations. Let me share with you very briefly something said by the people from Saturn when they were with us earlier this week here on campus in Blacksburg. They suggested that they certainly don't mean to envision that there is no conflict at the workplace, despite the fact that this is one of the most highly cooperative union management relationships in the entire country, where the UAW was involved in the Group of 99 from the startup of the organization, designing the product, designing the plant. But rather their approach is the following: that conflict can be constructive and that it can be used positively by the organization. So that may be a first question. How can union management, what is a constructive union management relationship? A second dilemma or implication from the GM Hydromatic case involves the following question, and that is, Should the parties interested in joint activities initially work to change their relationship, or should they focus immediately on joint task accomplishment? Change the relationship or work on joint tasks? That's the question. Focusing on changing the relationship of the union leadership and management leadership may result in some momentum being lost. Relationship building takes time. Relationship building takes time, but initial expectations are high, and the successes that are achieved in terms of building employee involvement need to be reinforced so as to ensure commitment and momentum. The point here is that you shouldn't necessarily focus initially on changing the relationship to the exclusion of emphasizing some joint tasks or accomplishments. Perhaps some simultaneous form or some simultaneous focus on both the relationship and task accomplishments is necessary. Those leaders, the research evidence indicates to us, who demonstrate people-oriented, relationship-building behaviors and task-oriented behaviors seem to be the most effective. So some type of a joint focus on the relationship and on task accomplishment is important. A third dilemma or implication in terms of employee involvement: should employee involvement joint activity structures be centralized or decentralized? Now, centralization will likely result in a greater consistency of effort and a greater consistency of direction and in a greater control of those efforts by upper management and the union leadership. It may also result, however, in a number of problems: a backlog of decisions, charges that the joint leadership perhaps is not responsive to people on the floor, and an inadequate monitoring of all of the activities. There is a dilemma, therefore, in terms of this question, centralization or decentralization, in terms of the need for accountability on the one hand and control, that is, accountability to top management and union leadership, control by top management and union leadership, versus the need to demonstrate trust and the need to encourage innovation. All right, so that's a very real dilemma or a very real issue. The dilemma of centralization versus the decentralization of the control over joint activities. One may need to have both aspects, centralization and decentralization. The centralized structure overlooking the employee involvement program can be used to establish overall goals, to allocate resources, to evaluate the progress of the program, and to provide reinforcement. The decentralized structure, on the other hand, down at the workplace level, can be used to select pilot projects, to identify the methodologies that are going to be used in the implementation of those projects, such as what types of measurements are going to be used, what types of training is needed, and finally to generate a sense of ownership over the change effort. So that's a third dilemma. The final dilemma is a very interesting one. How can the union expand its role as a partner in decisions affecting the business and at the same time maintain a role distinct from management's? A very real question in a number of unionized organizations. And this is leading to much of the debate within the labor movement by critics of employee involvement. You may be familiar with a movement within particularly the United Auto Workers known as New Directions, which is very much in favor of going back to the old, what they feel is the tried and tested method of improving working conditions, and that is adversarial labor relations. It was very interesting when the people from Saturn were here on campus this week that Mike Bennett, the local union president, gave a presentation to a group of top human resource managers from around the region. And frankly, I was struck by his presentation because it looked very much like something that might have been used in one of our own business policy and strategy courses here in the Department of Management at Virginia Tech. Not only did he have state-of-the-art slides, but he was talking very much from a perspective of how, in order to share wealth with employees, the organization needed to focus on competitiveness. Okay? Mike Bennett quoted extensively from Walter Reuther, former president of the United Auto Workers. But I pointed out to him after the fact it was kind of ironic that he did not quote at all from Victor Reuther, who's associated, brother of Walter, who's associated with the New Directions movement. That is a very real problem for many managers in unionized organizations. That is, despite the fact that they're trying to bring the union in and participate in decision-making, you have at the same time a very real political conflict within the union. In a number of instances, the New Directions movement, the critics of union management cooperation and employee involvement, have successfully defeated local union presidents who have been trying to change the direction of union management relationships. At the Mazda Flat Rock plant outside of Detroit, for example, one of the few transplants, that is, where the union is in fact in place, a plant owned by the Japanese. At that plant, they've had some very serious problems recently in terms of this internal debate between cooperation and adversarial labor relations. What is the legitimate role for the labor union? That is a very real debate that needs to be addressed in American labor relations and human resource managements. The union clearly needs to help its members gain control of their work life and use all of their skills. But what happens to their ability to challenge management's practices? That's a dilemma that's waiting to be addressed in many of your organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today on our seminar on managing human relations. We hope you will be with us for the next in the series on August the 8th, when Walter Fabrici and Benjamin Blanchard will discuss concurrent life cycle engineering for total quality. This teleconference is designed for people from business and industry needing information about engineering design and product development to assure superior quality products. It is also for people from service organizations who view service as a product and how to systematically design those services to assure quality outcomes. And it is for the people from both industry and service organizations who, through effective leadership and management of the organization, can design concepts to create a competitive edge. I'm Stan Huffman from the campus of Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. Good day.